Audio is the most important part of your live stream. If people can't hear, they're not going to watch. And the reality is that audio is often neglected, especially by video people. Video people naturally focus on the visuals. And unless you're in a pretty high-end setup, whatever is being mixed and heard in the room is what's sent to the web. The problem is recordings sound vastly different than the in-live room experience. There's no crowd interaction, you don't hear what's happening on the stage, and there's usually big changes in the recording in volume between music and speaking. Therefore, improving your audio is actually the easiest way to improve your live stream. Again, if people can't hear, it doesn't matter how pretty it is. They're not going to watch. But if they can hear, they can tolerate a less than ideal visual. Even if the mix isn't perfect, if we can make the levels consistent so people don't have to turn things up and down, we're well on our way to having a good sounding live stream. To make this happen, we need to master our audio. So in our context, we're not going to talk about the fancy mastering process that could happen when you have a dedicated web mix. Instead, our first and primary goal of mastering is just to make levels consistent. If we can do that, people will be happy. A well-mastered stream means no turning up or turning down from music to preaching back to music again. And you can see this in a waveform of a well-executed live stream. A well-mastered live stream will have a pretty consistent waveform in terms of visual levels. No part should be significantly louder than any other part. And an unmastered live stream, we're going to see pretty significant jumps in between music and preaching. This will also make it just easier in general to hear. People are used to hearing mastered content on their devices, whether they're at home or listening on their phones. How do we make the levels consistent? We're going to do this with dynamics processing. Specifically, we're going to use a compressor. Dynamics are the difference in amplitude between the loudest and quietest parts of the signal. Digital audio is measured from a negative value of minus 60, 80, sometimes even minus 100, all the way up to a maximum of 0. So we're dealing with negative numbers. The quietest parts are going to reside in that minus 60 to minus 80, and the loudest parts are going to reside in that minus 6 to 0. It's going to be that red or yellow part of the meter. Anything below 60 or 80 is so quiet, it's indistinguishable from noise when we turn it up. And anything above 0 in a digital audio signal is clipped. It's permanently distorted and destroyed, and there's nothing we can do to get it back. Our goal when we master is to get everything to sit right at the top of that kind of yellow range without hitting the very top of the red. So we want it to be kind of minus 6 to 0, but not above 0. At first, it might seem like turning everything up is the answer. Well, partially that will work, but the quiet parts will get louder, but the loud parts will get too loud. We'll clip the signal when the band or preacher gets loud. We can't have that. Instead, we want to increase the perceived loudness by decreasing the dynamic range. We're going to turn everything down so we can safely turn everything up. We'll use a compressor on the audio signal to turn the loud parts down. That way we can safely turn everything up, making the quiet parts easy to hear and the loud parts won't be distorted or overpowering. Let me repeat that concept one more time. Compression turns down the loud parts of your signal. This makes the overall signal more consistent, but overall quieter, and then gives us the room so that all of the signal can be turned up without fear of clipping. We're going to turn down the loud parts so that the quiet parts can be turned up. Compression works on the idea of thresholds and ratios. The threshold is how loud is too loud, and ratio is how much we turn down that loud part of the signal. Zero compression has a 1-to-1 ratio. The signal in equals the signal out. If we just turn down everything equally, we're just making a quieter signal. We're not making those loud parts quieter. So let's look at a real-world situation. Currently, I have a compressor on an unmastered signal. The signal in equals the signal out. There's no compression being applied. And we can see that the signal is very low. It's sitting in between minus 30 on the input and minus 30 on the output. Now, as we bring the threshold down, we can start applying some compression. You can see that slope is happening, and that's the ratio. I'm just going to keep bringing this threshold down until we see some visual gain reduction in the middle here. So I'm going to keep pulling this down to about minus 40. And you can see, there we go, now we're getting some gain reduction. A well-compressed signal isn't going to have a ton of compression happening. We don't want it to be smushed all the time. We just want to hit those loud parts so that everything is consistent. So you can see from the graph here, our input is sitting between -20 and -30, and the gain is being reduced every once in a while. So if a signal is below -40, it's unaffected. And if it's above -40, it's being turned down with a ratio of 2 to 1. That means if the signal is at -20 with a 2 to 1 over 40, we're 20 decibels above our threshold. But because our ratio is 2 to 1, those 20 decibels in are going to turn into 10 decibels out. Now if I turn up that ratio, say to 4 to 1, you see the line gets even steeper. And then if we're 20 decibels over our threshold, only 5 decibels come out. So 20 in, 5 out above our threshold. So you can see we're really kind of aggressively turning down the gain, turning down the signal. And in fact, it's probably too much because now that gain reduction is always on. So we don't want that necessarily. That was just for demonstration purposes. But let's leave our threshold here and let's just turn down the ratio a little bit. We don't need to reduce that much. But if we go back to 2 to 1 here, you can see that there's sometimes it's taken a little bit off, but it's not taking off the whole signal. So now let's look at our input and our output and what's happening. So our signal is coming in, and once it gets above that threshold, it's being turned down. If you look at the input meter is actually higher than the output meter, just like we'd expect, because we're taking those loud parts and turning them down. So the final step that needs to happen is make up gain. Now that we've made the whole wave smaller, we want to take that whole wave and push it up higher. Now our output is higher than our input, and we know we're not going to clip because we're applying that gain reduction using the threshold and the ratio. Now if the ratio gets too high, we can start getting kind of a muffled sound on the signal, and we don't want that. So generally a good ratio is in between 1 to 2, 1 to 4. If we go much above 1 to 8, it's a really aggressive signal modification, and we don't want that. We just want to make sure that everything is being kind of pushed into place a little bit. We still want to be able to hear the ups and downs of the music. So you can see 8 to 1 here is a really aggressive thing, and it's pushing down the top. Now what I might do is just bring that threshold up, so only the very top of the signal is being pushed off, push the makeup gain up. We might be able to just turn everything up, and only a small bit that really could be clipped is going to be turned down really aggressively with that ratio. So that might work, but again, the ratio is pretty strong. We want to usually keep that below an 8 to 1. Finally, let's talk about how compression works over time. So far we've talked about how compression works with amplitude of the signal, the loudness of the signal. But compressors also work over time. That's where we get attack, hold, and release. That's where those come into play. Now, attack impacts how fast the compressor engages once the threshold is passed. So if it gets above our threshold of -40, how fast is it going to turn that down? Hold is how long the compressor is going to hang on at full strength once it's engaged. And release is how fast the compressor disengages once the threshold is passed on its way back down. Think of this as a fade in and a fade out, the attack, hold, and release. In review, compression reduces the dynamic range of an audio signal. We're turning down the loudest parts. This allows us to safely turn up the overall mix without clipping, so that quiet parts are easy to hear and loud parts aren't overwhelming. And this makes it sound like everything else that we're used to hearing, so we can listen to the stream in our cars, loud environments, or even when the kids are running around. Add a compressor to the audio on your live stream, and the overall quality of your live stream experience will instantly increase.